Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
I'm Mellisa Smith.
I'm Serena Halstead, and welcome to Data Lit, a podcast for educators by educators. Today's episode is a one-off in our third season. Now, while I'm very optimistic that in the very near future, we will be talking less about the pandemic, we realize that we have learned so much about ourselves and about it in general. And we have learned this through data collection and research, as well as individuals sharing their own experiences. Now, with that being said, I'm going to turn to Mellisa and Spencer. And what I want to know from you guys, what is one lesson you have learned about data during this pandemic?
So during the pandemic, I feel as though as a public, we were inundated with more data than we typically are. At least it felt so, or maybe we were all home watching it. So it felt as though we had more data. And so you had to constantly recognize the usefulness of data. And then I feel as though we were also trying to be able to question the reliability of data. And those two types of data literacy skills is not just for data analysts. It's like all of us were sitting down there receiving information, and we all had to be quote unquote data analysts trying to make sense of what was happening. And while during the pandemic, I took a SAS course called Data Literacy Essentials that described data literacy as how a person interacts with data to make sense of the world around them, which is a little bit of a broader definition that I had been thinking about it before. Because I'd have to admit, even though we've been doing this podcast now for 3 seasons, I was thinking of data literacy as data just for teachers.
Yeah.
And if you ask me outside of this, outside of my job and what I do with data, do you have to be data literate? I was just like, well, no, you don't usually interact with data. But during the pandemic, it made me see that we are interacting with data, right? Every day you're interacting with data. Every day when I'm driving on the road, I'm interacting. Like I'm receiving information and I'm making decisions, right? When I go to the doctor, when I'm trying to pick out my cell phone plan, like every day we're interacting with data. And so it is so important for us to be data literate, not just as educators, but just as, I guess, as human beings.
Right. And it makes me think, I've been reading, Thinking Fast and Slow? In that book, they talk about how we essentially have 2 systems for thinking. One system for thinking is automated. Like it's essentially subconscious. We're on auto drive. We don't really consciously reflect on it. Right. But then the other system of thinking is what we're focusing on. We're making conscious decisions, and it takes a lot more effort and all those kind of things. I think a lot of our data analysis as humans, like you gave the example of driving, happens in that system that's just, we're not thinking about it. And perhaps the pandemic forced us to put a lot of new data into the system of thinking that we have to actually be conscious about. And I think that was uncomfortable for all of us.
Yeah, because you were constantly getting data from from the government, from the World Health Organization. So you're getting data, but still you were asked to sort of make sense of it. And it seemed to come from a reliable source, but depending on the news or the slant that they put on it, you were starting to question data in a way that I didn't think we had to question data before, which is good, which I think we should question data, right? But we hadn't been doing so before. And so, again, in order to question data, you need to be or have a sense of data literacy. Like you have to have some data literacy skills. You have to understand data in order to question data.
That's true. I'm just going back thinking about, you mentioned the word, whether it's reliable, and then I'm thinking, then who defines reliability? We hear the word reliability, right. We hear validity, we hear all of these, fancy terminologies that it's very much essential to keep us researchers grounded in what we're saying, to, be consistent with what we're saying. But then, as you mentioned, Mellisa, I think I've never stopped to really question this whole terminology, reliability and validity, until the pandemic. I've heard it, I've seen it in my studies, but not this pandemic has forced me to think, what is this am I really saying when I say something is reliable?
Yeah, and like y'all are saying, this in theory is a good thing. This is how we should be approaching data. There's this idea, the neglective probability bias, that our brains want to think of something as either 0% accurate or 100% accurate. I think this pandemic has forced us, because there are so many confounding variables, to realize that that's not the case with anything, be it we're looking at pandemic data or student learning data or whatever it might be. And this was always the case, but the pandemic just shined such a light on it that it forced us to be more aware that all data is going to fall somewhere between those two poles. And it's our job then as educators or humans to figure out the probability and what to do with it based on what's telling me and what's not telling me, which in theory is good, that's learning. But like, as we know with education, you always want new learning to come in a really low stakes formative manner.
Yeah.
And these lessons came in a very high stakes manner that I think that's where maybe that cognitive dissonance came from. Yeah. It's good to learn about these things, but you don't want to do it in a way that feels so loaded. That's
learning
not good learning.
While you're scared was a little scary.
Yeah, we're still learning. We're scared, but we're learning.
We're learning while we're scared.
Yeah, and that's and the fact is, like, with the amygdala, you can't really learn. That's not a good way to form long-term memories. Right. The memories you're forming is to avoid that stuff because it was scary. So I guess the question is, as we hopefully move out of this pandemic, how can we pull some of these insights and keep them with us? Right. And I think what we're trying to do with this episode a little.
So what about you, Spencer? What did you learn?
Along similar lines, I think that in education, in schools, that we need a more expansive view of data. That too often, I'll speak for myself, when I thought of data, I thought of summative scores, But especially as I've worked more with y'all, that I've learned the value of other student learning data. But in particular, the pandemic, I think, really showed me that what happens outside of school has a huge impact. And of course, so collecting, for instance, social emotional data. And this could be something that is quantitative and formal as we're starting to look into screeners and some different ways to look at this. But it also could be something that's very qualitative and informal. The importance of data, of just chatting with your students as they come in to see how they're doing, what kind of state they're in, what they need. Because otherwise, the summative assessment might say 72%. But we know that there's a lot of, going back to our previous talk, there's a lot of variables outside our 4 classroom walls that impacted that 72%.
So thinking about expanding the data that we collect, even though right now it feels as though we collect a lot of data, maybe we have to start thinking about collecting a different type of data. And I think there are people who are collecting different type of data, which is what we're going to find out in this series when we start to talk about other people who are using other pieces of data that we don't typically think about.
Right. And, not just, finding other pieces of data, but also making it come together, making it make sense, merging the ideas from different fields to make it make sense. Because at the end of the day, as you mentioned, students and how they're learning best, the social emotional part of it. But there are different schools of thought. And at the end, we want it to come to benefit our students and the way we go about teaching our students.
Yeah. What about you, Serena? What did you learn?
So for me, I would want to say I've learned to be somewhat cautious, and I'm not going to say I'm holding myself, at a standstill, no. But I have learned somewhat to be cautious about how I go about making conclusive statements or decision based on data that we have at one point in time. Naomi Oreskes noted, science is a process of learning and discovery. And sometimes we learn that what we thought was correct, it is wrong. This pandemic has allowed us to uncover more data, as Mellisa mentioned, about how students learn best, whether it was in person or virtual. And, the pandemic, it has caused us to revisit and question the validity of some of our historical data. And not to say that I'm saying the historical data wasn't true, but for this present point in time, does this information still hold true? And so my learning from this is that, moving forward, when I'm going to make a decision or for, whoever, whether it be at home or be it in the workplace, I really need to think about the current data, what historical data had to say, but what is happening at this point in time. How can I best take that past information and merge it with new information that I'm learning and make sense of it and make others, help others to make sense of it so that it can be beneficial for all who is involved in using this data?
I appreciate just the flexibility in the mindset there, that we should never think of data as permanent, kind of similar to like student learning data, that we should always think about how we can use it formatively, so that can change because we're looking for growth. So no data point is concrete and completely conclusive. It's just another piece of evidence that we're gathering as we're trying to move through life, I suppose.
I think the part that Serena mentioned that resonated with me is, again, it's something that you have a collection in one point in time, right?
Yeah.
So if you isolate it, you can get some information. But again, it is something in a bigger context. So that you have to narrow in and also zoom out at the same time. Like narrowing gives you one view, but you also have to then look at how it fits in context with other things, and that gives you another sense as well. So both things have to be at play to kind of make sense of data.
I like that. Just to wrap up, be willing to make or embrace changes as new data becomes available. Mm-hmm. And that's where that flexibility piece comes in. Also question the data source, check for its validity and its reliability. And moreover, seek to understand the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of the data. We look at the numbers a lot, but, we need to be on the grounds to keep a perspective of it based on their experiences. So in our next episode, we will be looking at rubrics. We will be definitely getting a chance to speak to some experts in the field. We have in mind Susan Brookhart and definitely our educators in Wake County. And we'd like to thank Maya Smith at Enloe for the music provided. If you have any questions, comments, or further notes for us, you can contact us at www.wcpss.net/Data Lit. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.